So John Clare was a contemporary of Lord Byron and Keats, so this is kind of the period just after the French Revolution. And the thing that really kind of stands out with John Clare is that he is very much one with nature. Whilst Wordsworth does talk about the landscape of the Lake District and about the people within this landscape, he really focuses on that. Clare is much more one with the landscape. And it's very interesting as well because, quite frankly, the fens are very boring. They're flat. Farms, fields, you have kind of like the Roman drains. That's it, really. So John Clare was born into a family of agricultural workers. His father was a farmer. He left school at the age of 11 and he'd actually started part-time work at the age of 8 in the fields. So he could read, he could write, he could do basic numeracy, but there wasn't an awful lot in terms of education after that. However, John Clare did come across a book of poems that one of the other agricultural workers had and he read, and this was called The Seasons by James Thomson. So this was a book of poetry and Clare absolutely fell in love with it. And because of this, he started writing his own poetry. Very interestingly, his mother was completely illiterate, meaning that she didn't read or write at all. She couldn't. And she took some of his early poems and actually used them in the fire to kind of keep the house warm without realising that they were, these beautiful artistic things that he was trying to, practice and get out. John Clare's family was very poor and he had to leave school so early because he had to be earning money in order to keep the family out of the poorhouse, particularly in seasons when the crops were bad and things like that. However, his family weren't entirely illiterate. His father could actually, he could read music, he played folk fiddle and sung lots of folk ballads to Clare throughout his life, and John Clare also taught himself to read music as well. Clare was influenced by the Gypsies and the Gypsy song, who were also in the area at the time, so there's a lot of influence going on, but it's kind of within this community, and the sense of community is very, very important to Clare, not only in terms of people, but the landscape itself was his community. That was really his home, and he's just really ingrained. Wordsworth, he went and studied, as we said, in Cambridge and then travelled Europe and things, and Clare never did any of that. He went to London 3 times in his life, and other than that he pretty much stayed in the Helpston and Lincolnshire area, apart from later in his life when he was kind of put into homes, which wasn't really his decision. Clare was a great observer of nature. He was really inside the landscape rather than looking at it from above. He was really inside it, and he walked everywhere. From John Clare Cottage you can actually take some of the walks that Clare used to do himself, kind of up closer to the Stamford area, near Burley and so on and so forth. He also uses an awful lot of Lincolnshire dialect, which is really interesting. He uses it very sparingly, but it is there, which means it's, it has to be from here and nowhere else. For example, in the poem The Mouse's Nest, he uses words such as gulch and prog. Prog kind of means like prod and poke. So the language, he's not doing this deliberately in an academic sense. It's a very casual, this is the word I want to use. I'm taking you on a walk with me through, the land that is just an extension of myself. And he's taking the reader on this wonderful journey, not in a sense of, oh yes, look at this, blah, 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 but it's, come on a walk with me, and, let's look at these, look at the birds, look at their eggs, look how they're, they're like this in the nest, and, oh, you can see the ladybird here, and the stream, and, ah, yes, this oak has been here since blah, blah, blah. He really intimately knows this landscape. There was a lot of research at the time going into finding what is generally described as the English Robert Burns. So Robert Burns was kind of the Scottish peasant poet, and a lot of publishers were going around trying to find the English equivalent, and John Clare was certainly a very good contender. Because of this, he was found by a publisher in Stamford who locally kind of published his early poems and works and kind of helped him you know, gain a bit of fame and also gain some money from local patrons. For better or for worse, the publisher from Stamford, their cousin was actually a publisher in London, and whilst discussing things, this cousin in London also took on Clare's poems and published them there, which is why John Clare went down there 3 times to London. It was to kind of promote his published works. He was having a portrait painted of him and so on. And this is a very, very different life, like we were saying earlier in the class, a very long time ago now. You had the poorer people. At this point you had the poorer people in the countryside doing the farming work, and it was the rich people who lived in the cities. So Clare was being taken out of some of the most impoverished places as a farmer and kind of just plonked into this very aristocratic London, you know, publishing house and stuff, and it was a bit of a shock to his system. He really felt like an outsider. He didn't feel comfortable, and he was very scared actually of being dropped, because this kind of search for the English Robert Burns would continue and continue, and as soon as they thought that they found someone who might be a bit better, the one who was kind of in this place already gets, you know, shoved to the side, and then they don't really get any of their work published or promoted as much as maybe the newer one who they think might be better, and they're all kind of switching about a lot. So Clare really had this fear of abandonment in that sense, and also a fear of losing what he knew, and this unfortunately happened at the age of 16. This was when all of the land, including Helpston, started to be privatised. Again, this was called the enclosure. So during the enclosure, over the first 10 years, this was really Clare's kind of his years where he was really growing up and really becoming an adult. What happened was, you know, his landscape, his home, his extension of himself, it just changed. What they would do is, places he would walk were now closed off, trees were cut down, the landscape was remoulded into whatever the owners wanted, and this hurt him quite a lot, and this was one of the main themes that ran through in his poetry. Fallen Elm is the main one here, kind of the big one that really describes the changing landscapes. It's a very long poem, but I will put it in the email that goes along with these videos so you can have a read. And unfortunately, as his life kind of continued, his fears came true, and he was kind of pushed aside. Despite the fact that his poetry was getting better and better, he kind of started to get ignored by the publishers, so now he was kind of a bit too famous, well known, and you know, to fit in with what was happening in Helpston and in the village life, as well as the village changing and him feeling really uncomfortable and really heartbroken by this. But he also didn't fit into this kind of, and never did, but even more so now, into this aristocratic kind of city life in London where all the other artists and poets were. So because of this, he actually started to have a lot of difficulties with his mental health. At the end of his life, he was taken into what were called then lunatic asylums. He was technically diagnosed with lunacy, although this isn't a word that we would use nowadays, and he never lived back in Helpston again. He did actually, his first home that he was taken to was in Essex. The security wasn't exactly great back then. It wasn't literally kind of a, you know, you're shot in a straitjacket and, you know, locked in a room forever. You know, it was kind of more like a residential home, but for, you know, people with mental health problems. And you know, he just kind of walked out the door one day and said, okay, I'm gonna go home now, and walked 80 miles back to Helpston. They weren't very happy about this. He also wrote a poem about that called Journey Out of Essex, which is very interesting too. And this kind of peaks and peaks until he writes his most famous poem of all, called I Am. So this deals with loss, the loss of the landscape, the loss of his identity, and you know, he's kind of like in the Schubertian era, he's gone from this sense of, you know, just the landscape to a sense of existential questioning. But it's really beautiful and very interesting how, again, he's not moving from being in a landscape to being existential. You know, he is the landscape, and now the landscape is having a what am I moment as well, as it transforms with the Industrial Revolution, and it's beautiful work and very fascinating. So my challenge to you guys, you can have a go now, we'll certainly have a go later, is to write a song and set some John Clare. Having looked at what we've looked at this lesson in terms of word setting and what the poetry means, writing pastorales in music, I want you to think about, I'll attach a few different poems that you can kind of have a look at, but I want you to think about, okay, what does this mean here? Am I writing literally about the nature, or are there deeper meanings? Again, look, at music we look at, are there deeper meanings? The same happens in literature, and what we need to do as composers in this case is to take these deeper meanings and really, accentuate them and bring them out in the music that we're writing. And I can't really do that here, but we can look at ways in terms of compositional techniques and sound worlds that, you can bring out what you want. But for now, think about what you could do. Maybe find a text that you like and just keep hold of it for a while. All of John Clare's work is out of copyright. He's been dead for a while, so that's all fine. So they're all online. Go have a look, really explore. We are incredibly lucky to have one of the most pivotal figures in British poetry and British literature literally on our doorstep. So I think this is a great thing that we should be celebrating and looking at, and something that we can really put into our music and our creative practice. This is not strict homework, by the way, just making that clear. Not that kind of person. Also, I have no idea how much you've all got on at the minute. I can imagine some of you are busier than normal and some of you are bored stiff. But certainly do kind of have a little look and just prepare yourself for what will inevitably be our next compositional project, whenever that may be. I hope you've enjoyed this class. Sorry for the kind of sleepy ending. I hope you'll have a great week, and I will see you next time. Good night.